If it all goes tits up, it's been a great ride.
Let us flip to page 114.
In your hymn books. That doesn't make you Gandhi, it just makes you an adult. If human history is a day, we only started eating meat at 10 to midnight.
You're not going to fix the climate crisis if you don't want to get sad.
Gotta get sad to get happy. It's called therapy.
We're all disgusting. And I'm like, I don't want to feel really stressed.
Why do I do this to myself?
What was that? Like, why is Spider-Man telling me to drink milk?
Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you haven't been here before, my name is Leena and I am ridiculous. Today I'm starting a new series because who can stop me? Nobody. I really love reading and I really struggle to talk about the climate crisis. One of the issues is that I feel like when somebody tells me there's going to be no life in the future, like life might die, brain can't compute. No, shut down, not happening. But if somebody says there won't be reading in the future, there was going to be no books, somehow that makes my brain panic in the way that it should be panicking about bigger things. So, in the interests of using the small and potentially insignificant to talk about bigger issues, I am starting this series called No Books on a Dead Planet, where I am inviting people onto the channel to chat to me about one book on the climate crisis, a book that you might be scared to read and scared to have a conversation around, those kind of really squirming conversations that are really scary to have with your friends. And we're gonna read those books for you, have that conversation for you, in the hopes that maybe afterwards you will pick up that book or have that conversation, or at least come away knowing a little bit more about the horizon and the many kind of sliding doors options that might be coming for us all. The aim is to have fun too, so this is going to be a relaxed conversation, and obviously for a fun, relaxed, intellectual, completely chaotic conversation, the only obvious first guest had to be Ariel Bissett. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Leena. I'm very excited to be on the pilot of your newest show.
Was this evil genius rubbing of the hands like,
because I snuck my way back in, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, we're here.
Don't leave your back doors open. You never know who's going to come through. So Ariel is an incredible person, she also has a YouTube channel that is BookTube, but also she's renovating her ancient and amazing haunted house. So definitely check that out.
Only mildly haunted.
But yeah, but as I've done something very dangerous today, and I have asked probably one of my best friends in the world to read one of my favourite books in the world. Now, this can always go wrong.
Yeah.
And I actually haven't talked to Ariel about what she's thought of the book. No. So I'm really being vulnerable here. And we're going to find out now what Ariel thinks of the book. This book is, I'm going to get more into it when we get into the questions, but this book is one that I chat everybody's ears off about all the time. So if you haven't been to the channel before, this might be new to you, but for most of you, you'll be rolling your eyes to the back of your head because you'll be like, fucking hell, Leena, yeah, we get it, read We Are the Weather. But the book we're going to be chatting about is We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. What's interesting about this book is that Jonathan Safran Foer is not a scientist. He's not even really a non-fiction writer. He's mainly a fiction writer, but he's written a non-fiction book about the climate, and it's one that I read a couple of years ago, and it changed my life, which is again vulnerable to say because other people have picked it up and thought, what a pile of shit. But that's the way with books, isn't it? That is the way with books. Yeah. So Ariel, thank you so much for reading the book, and we're going to get on to chatting about the book in a second. But first, there's a question that I wanted to ask you, which is just how often do you have conversations about the climate crisis in your life? And how do you feel about that statistic, if we're going to call it that? Because it's something that I think we talk about a little bit, yes. But it's not something that I find comes up naturally in a lot of conversations. And I wanted to hear from your perspective, like how often do you have those kind of conversations, and how do you feel about that?
That's a really interesting question because you had, in fact, sent it to me before we recorded. And it actually made me pause. I had to pause and kind of consider, wait, you're right. How often do I actually have conversations about climate change? Because that is actually quite different than how often do I think about climate change? And upon reflection, I've realized most of the conversations I have about climate change are with myself. Something that Mr. Jonathan Safran Foer seems to be doing as well in the later half of the book. But I realized that a lot of the things I'm thinking about, the paths I'm trying to navigate, and the actions I'm trying to decide like what to do about, those are all things that I've been doing with myself. And I definitely talk about it with friends, but I don't talk about it very often with other people. And I think it's because it's a very stressful conversation. It usually just devolves into depression, right? Like, it's not even anger.
It's not a party conversation, is it?
No. Sometimes it like devolves into anger. Usually not at anyone, just kind of at the situation at large, which is kind of unhelpful. Or it devolves into like sadness, and you're just like, well, I don't really want to make my friend sad or me sad, and like we're all on our own journeys, so but that is maybe one of the points of the book. Like, even if these are difficult conversations, we can't shy away from them. So it actually is part of the reason I'm really excited about this series overall, Leena, because it's gonna feel like your videos are so good at doing this, but like it's gonna feel like having a lot of discussions and a lot of conversations helped by clever people writing clever books. So that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, it's interesting what you say, because I think, again, I actually, when I was looking at my answers to the questions, I wrote down, like, I have imaginary conversations with podcast hosts about the climate crisis all the time.
There you go. So we're doing the same thing. We're just we feel like we're having conversations, but I guess more it's consuming media.
Yeah, we're overhearing conversations and stuff. And I think it's interesting because it feels like such a serious topic that it feels unbring-upable, because you're basically ruining somebody else's day. But then at the same time,
similarly, would you bring up religion?
Right? I mean, you're asking the wrong person.
You're true. You're right. But like, you know what I mean? Like, would you say to someone, how often do you talk about religion with your friends? I'm like, I don't. I never do, right? Because it's going to do is bring up dark memories of people's childhoods, and like it's just going to be stressful. So like you just don't. But I guess one thing that is different about, what is that saying? Like, don't bring up politics, religion, or money. Like which is an interesting at the Christmas table. Yeah, it's an interesting concept, because often if you're with friends that you truly can trust and talk about, or with family that are your friends, those will often be the most interesting conversations, right? Like philosophies around how you live your life. But I guess one thing that's different about climate change is that it isn't just this personal decision. Whereas a lot of the time it's like, oh, well, like my financial situation is my private financial situation, and I don't want to discuss that with others. It's like, well, actually, your diet does affect me, and it does affect other people. So that is an interesting difference.
Yeah, it's not a kind of isolated thing that you can ask somebody else's advice on, and then they can be like, oh, this is what you should do about your boyfriend. It's like, no, this is, do you know what I mean? Like, it's like something that is so intertwined that you can't talk about your own behaviour without accidentally talking about other people's behaviour.
Yeah.
And that's what's super awkward. The thing about this book, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is like our first impressions of the book before we read it. Now, obviously, you can probably remember yours a lot more vividly.
Ish. It's funny because I bought this book like 5 years ago. I mean, I guess I don't know exactly when it came
when I
out.
asked you about it, you turned around and you were like, I have it. It's over there.
Yeah, I bought it, and I have it in hardcover too, which is a problem with me. I not anymore. I'm a reformed hardcover buyer, okay? In 2021, I did a challenge that I would only buy a hardcover if I was actually going to read it that month. And it meant I bought like 5 hardcovers. Well, there was a bit more than that, but either I read them or I felt guilty. So it was perfect. No, I think the book came out in 2019. So I guess that's not as long ago as I thought. But I did buy it the year it came out because I remember hearing people talking about it and being like, this is really interesting. But also, I guess I didn't even let you fully finish asking the question, but I also own Eating Animals. A book I read a quarter of. This is also a problem Ariel has.
This isn't this book specific. This is just generally.
I start so many books and then I don't finish them.
I don't know. I have the same thing. But
I don't care about it. I don't feel any guilt about it. It just bothers a lot of other readers. They're like, oh, why would you not have finished that book? I'm like, I don't know. I guess I wasn't reading it at the right time. But this was a really interesting read. And here's what's funny. This is very specifically about eating animals.
So you've read that one?
No, I only read a quarter of this.
Oh, this is okay.
And it was so depressing and scary. I got to the section on fish, and I was like, oh, geez, okay, I'm going to take a little break on that one. And then he comes out with this book, which is kind of seems, from the marketing, to be more in general about the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. So I was like, okay, maybe that's my first book of his, and then I can go more deep into the Eating Animals. This is just Eating Animals Part 2.
So page 62, he's like, So for the last 62 pages, I haven't been admitting to you what this book is actually about, which is actually still about eating animals.
It's still eating animals. I just wanted to keep writing about eating animals.
The interesting kind of genesis story of the book, before I talk about how I discovered it, is that Eating Animals is like a prolific book about being vegetarian or being vegan. And it's often the book that a lot of people quoted to me when I said, why did you become vegetarian? And they'd be like, I obviously read the book by Jonathan Safran Foer. And I'm like, okay, cool. So it's like kind of like one of those seminal texts that, again, I was also avoiding because I was like, obviously, if I read this book, like all of these people that I know that are more intelligent than I respect a lot have read it and changed their mind. So if I read this book, I'll change my mind and therefore I'm going to have to do something about it. And I'm really not in the mood to do that right now. So I'm not going to read it. And then I was sent this book actually at work when it came out in January 2019, it must have been.
Okay.
And it sat under my desk for a whole freaking year.
Hell yeah.
For a whole year. Yeah. Every morning I'd come into work and it would be sitting like under my desk, like on the floor, and I'd look at it and be like, not today. Not today. And then just before the pandemic, I actually read it because I found it in audiobook, and I was looking for an audiobook that was shorter, that had like a really good reader, and he reads it himself and he has quite a nice voice. So I ended up listening to it, and I mean, subsequently for me, that was the reason I gave up eating animals.
Nailed it.
Eat a bit of dairy. Nailed it. But unfortunately I was correct, and that is why I put it off for so long, which is so silly because I even got this book for free. Like, it was just every day it looked at me in the face and I was like, oh, it's kind of like, you know, you have like a pile in your house of like papers that one day you're going to sort out and file, and you every day you look at it and then you just stop seeing it because you're like, oh, that's just part of my life now.
That's my pile.
Yeah, exactly.
You see it though. You only on the video. You can only see part of my book pile. That's only part of the pile I need to read. I think that's really interesting, and I think that he'd be really excited that it actually did make you a vegetarian. So wait, are you saying this one made you a vegetarian, not this one? It didn't. I
haven't read that one.
It didn't even take Eating Animals Part 1. You just skipped to the sequel.
Yeah, I realised what I didn't say was the genesis story of this book for Jonathan Safran Foer. He wrote that book like 15 years ago now, and he toured that book around the world. It was really successful. It obviously changed a lot of people's minds, and he was like, to be honest, as I was touring that book and as other things started happening in my life and I went through like grief and stuff like that, I'd travel between these events and I'd eat animals. I'd eat animals for comfort. I would be in a airport and feel depressed and buy a burger, and that is what I have been doing. So I now want to write a book reflecting on that experience of having toured a book and advocated for animal rights and for climate crisis stuff and lived a contradiction and not been perfect and felt shame and embarrassment. So I'd say this book is kind of about eating animals, but it's also kind of about shame and resistance and knowing something but not believing it, and the kind of contradictions of that.
Yeah.
What did you think about it after you've read it? Like, you can tell me the truth, Ariel. I won't be hurt. Like, would you recommend this to somebody else?
Okay, I'll just rip off this Band-Aid.
It's okay.
I liked it, but I did not love it. That's my truth. I have to live in my truth. I still love you. I still love the series. And again, not to literally, Leena did not ask me in any way to praise this series or hype up the series, but one of the reasons I'm so excited about this like book club, basically. Are you calling it a book club? It's basically a book club, right?
But there's no you can be in the club if you don't read any of the books.
Right. So maybe I shouldn't call it book club because book club has hesitations.
There's such thing as a chat club. I think it should be a chat club.
Yes. Conversation club. Part of the reason I'm really excited about this is because I don't think that... Well, I definitely don't think that we have the book on climate change yet, because otherwise it would come to mind, right? Yeah. Like, we would be like, oh, well, obviously the book on climate change is, like, maybe we know the documentary on climate change is An Inconvenient Truth. Like, it's like the granddad one. Yeah. But, like, I don't think we have the book on climate change yet. And here's my problem. Not problem, but, like, here's a problem.
Okay.
Climate change is so complicated and is going to take so many different solutions that I don't think there is going to be a book that fixes it or is the book or is enough, because there's so many different aspects. Yeah. So Jonathan Safran Foer's book is very much about eating animals. It's about like how a shift in your diet can make a giant impact. Do I believe that that is true? Yes. And interestingly enough, okay, so this is funny. I studied abroad in 2015 when I was 20.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was over there, I was in England. And when I was over there in London and in Birmingham, everyone thought I was a vegetarian. Everyone. I don't know why.
If you just get a nose ring, it's very easy. As soon as I got my nose pierced, everyone was like, oh, sorry, didn't mean to put that sausage near you.
Yeah, exactly. But I was like, I didn't have a nose ring. I just, maybe it's the long hair, something about the way I dress.
Carefree attitude.
Yeah, people were like, oh, you must be vegetarian. Like, people would literally be like, Ariel, I think the restaurant we're going to has vegetarian options. I'm like, why do people keep asking me this?
And I hope you enjoy those options.
I was like, I don't care. Like, it's fine, whatever. So I very much wasn't a vegetarian, even though people thought I was a vegetarian, until a few years later. But it was kind of funny. I think it was because people thought I was one that I started thinking maybe I'm supposed to be one. Like, then I started kind of looking into it. And it was actually climate change that made me become a vegetarian. And over the last 2 years, because of COVID, and this is partly what he talks about in this book, and definitely what he talks about in this book, because this book is largely about like the cultural impact of food, more so than We Are the Weather. Part of what he is saying is like there's so much cultural attachment to how we eat and how it affects our lives and how our daily lives impact the kinds of things that we're eating. So now that like the pandemic is happening and I'm living at home and I don't go out and my parents are here and my brother's here and my boyfriend's here, they all eat meat. So inevitably it started to creep back into my diet because it was like, okay, we made dinner and I'm like, I'm not going to make a whole separate dinner.
Yeah, because it's like you said, it's a shared decision. It's
right.
It's not like, oh, I do this and you do that. Like it's so hard to maintain something like that, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting, but I had a couple problems with the book, and I don't know if it's good to start with the problems because there were a lot of things we liked, but we are about to go into a lot of the good parts about it. So maybe I'll just preface with the reasons why it didn't work for me 100%. Why I didn't get to my like A range. Number one, so much anger. I felt Jonathan Safran Foer being so angry throughout the entire book that it made it a little hard to read for me.
Yeah.
But that felt, and this is part of the reason I wanted to bring this up, it feels like a personal reason that I didn't enjoy the book. Because I know that some people would read it and feel like relieved that somebody else is as angry as they are, or feel relieved or find it motivating, you know, like a rallying cry. This is not the kind of rallying cry that's going to work for me because I'm already stressed about it. I'm already worried. And so I want somebody to like take my hand and say, all right, here's what we need to do.
Yeah.
As opposed to him being like, I keep eating meat. I'm like, I'm sorry.
Why do I do this to myself? But I think like it's kind of cathartic for me because I'm also like I made a note in my book because this is actually the first time I've read the physical book. I've listened to it in audio like maybe 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
But I like wrote in my notes, I was like, oh, in the first half of the book it kind of feels like I'm being told off.
Yes.
And I didn't experience that in the audiobook at all. Like, it was really, like, the way he reads it is quite meditative. Like, it felt really reflective and calming. But when you read it on the page, it does feel a little bit like a telling off.
It
and
felt
that was, like,
to me
so
like
weird,
he was
I was
angry,
like,
but he's, like, not only angry at me, he's also really furious at himself. So it's not like he's only pointing the finger at us and he's like, all of your readers, you're terrible. You're all terrible. But no, he was like, we're all disgusting. And I'm like, I don't want to feel really stressed out. The other thing you just mentioned, page 63. And it's funny because I have written page 63 as one of my main problems with this book. Okay, here we go. Page 63. You've now read 62 pages of this book, right? You get to page 63, and he says, this is a book about the impacts of animal agriculture on the environment. And I'm like, okay, but you didn't talk about that at all in the first 62 pages. And so it was, for me, emblematic of this larger thesis problem I felt he had. I think maybe Eating Animals is a more direct book where he's like, obviously it's called Eating Animals, a very specific problem that I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about it from a bunch of different angles. This one's a little bit more memoir-y, like his life after eating animals. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I was like, I feel like this book could be half as long and more specific and more action-based and less about Jonathan Safran Foer's feelings and more about his thesis, which is an interesting thesis, animal agriculture. But, like, it took him 62 pages to even mention it for the first... Literally, Leena, I wrote, what? I don't know if you can see that, but I just wrote, what?
But I think one of the point, I don't know if it's translated, but maybe it's just, it doesn't help it for you. But for me, like, that was the point he was making, that he was like, see, isn't it easy to talk about climate change without talking about the cause of climate change? And this is what Al Gore did in An Uncomfortable Truth. Like, he didn't mention food, even though all of the science pointed to food. Al Gore was like, can't mention food.
Well, no, because that
will put people off.
Lobbying and the government.
So I guess to me it's probably like, and I get it's a tactic, but I get why he, in the same way that if you give your pet a pill and it doesn't take it, you put it in a cube of cheese and then you give it to him and he's like, I will take the pill now. This is the the first book is the pill and the second book is the pill wrapped in cheese. That's how I would. And I ate it up. I ate the cheese. Ironically, cheese.
I love that.
But he gives you 4 things. He says, have less children, give up your car, stop eating animals, and...
I forget the other one. But yeah, it was... His main piece of advice is, like, cut out meat for breakfast and lunch.
Yeah.
Like, if you can do that, you're cutting down 2/3 of your consumption of meat and, like, just only eat meat at dinner. Let's now shift in then. Yeah. Parts I did like. Because I did like loads.
Yeah, I think for me, like, that's like the stuff that didn't work for you is ironically like what made it work for me. Like, I had this,
and this is why we just need
everybody,
because we need to read lots of different things because not everyone is motivated by the same things.
It's kind of like you would approve of somebody there are people in my life that are dating people that I completely approve of, and I'm like, oh, what a great person! Like, so glad you're dating them. I would not personally date them. Yes. And they're very different. Yes. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's the same. It's like finding stuff that works for everybody. But what he's talking about, he purposely was like, I don't want to write a book of facts and I don't want to write a journalistic article. I want to write something more literary from the heart about the problems that I think are at the heart of why we won't stop eating animals and why we don't want to save ourselves and the implications of suicide and stuff. So I really liked it because it actually kind of focused on this idea of genocide and suicide and like,
that was a really big theme. I thought that was an interesting theme, but for me, it was such a despairing theme. Yeah. It just felt really sad.
Yeah. I think
I can already imagine the comments are like, Ariel, you're not going to fix the climate crisis if you don't want to get sad.
Like, gotta get sad to get happy. It's called therapy.
Well, okay, I have another question though, because like he said something. Did I write down the page? I definitely wrote down the page somewhere, but he talks about how, page 14. Wow, that was early on. But he talks about how, to his knowledge, or like so far, revealingly, the fate of our planet occupies an even smaller place in literature than it does in the broader cultural conversation. So he's talking about how there isn't very many novels or writers writing about climate change. And obviously this was written a couple of years ago. More and more is definitely happening. Like, we're seeing more and more climate fiction, etc. And like also nonfiction. But I do think it's really interesting. So I wanted to ask you, and I think this is probably going to be a theme for you throughout this series that you're filming, but like, have you found that books are the best way to motivate you to make climate action? Or have, like you said, this turned you into vegetarian. Yeah. So maybe it is. Or have you found documentary? Or have you found podcast? Or have you found that it needs to be a mixture of all three?
I think, but then this is the kind of person I am. I think that books have a bigger impact on me in general, whatever the topic is, because I can take them at my own pace and I carry them around with me in my day. And it's also a chance to like learn in private. Like nobody's there with me, and it's a thing that I can reflect on in my own time. So I think books have a big impact, and also because they're usually way better referenced and way less sensationalized than documentaries. Documentaries are cool, but I watched the Al Gore documentary when it came out. I think I was like 20. And I watched that and I was sad and I cried. And then I went to sleep and I got up the next day and I got on with my freaking day and I probably had a chicken sandwich. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can't, like, that, it's a very short amount of time to spend with an idea, and they're often quite impersonal because they're made by loads of people, whereas a book that's usually made by one person, it feels like, you know, like, sometimes I've changed my mind about stuff because one person that I care about has told me about how they feel about it, and that feels like a bigger impact than having a group of people tell you lots of snippets of things. You know? Sometimes sitting down and listening to one person's thoughts and experiences, like, changes my mind faster than a documentary. Not to say anything wrong with documentaries.
No,
but I think
but this is exactly what I'm talking about. We all need to find within books, like, the book that works for you and motivated you, but then within other forms of media. For me, for example, so far, the piece of media that has made the biggest impact to me, the fastest, the most, like, indelibly, has been the documentary The True Cost.
Yeah.
So I watched that many years ago. It might have been 2015, 2016. Many years ago, I watched this documentary, which is about the world of fast fashion. Not only its impact on people and people's working conditions, but mainly, like, like, how it impacts the environment and how we all need to think of the clothing that we wear as, like, permanent things that now exist in the universe, and, like, you don't throw them away or donate them and then they're gone. No, like, where are they now, and how does fast fashion work, and, like, how are these clothes actually made? There were so many moments throughout that were eye-opening. Like, genuinely, and I think that might be part of it. Like, they were things I didn't know. Like, I must emphasize, I did not know. I didn't know about all of the inks that were just poured into the rivers, right? I didn't know about all of these giant landfills just full of clothing. I didn't know about, I don't know, how certain fibers don't break down and, like, X, Y, Z. Or, like, there was an interesting history. I remember this history section, and I've only seen it once, so it's amazing how much I remember about it. But, like, I remember the section it had showing how, like, trend cycles used to not exist in fashion, and then they started being like, okay, there's 2, like, seasons in a year. It was, like, the warm clothing and the cold clothing, and then it started becoming a seasonal thing. Four times a year, like, stores would get new clothing, and now it's, like, literally weekly. Where H&M and Forever 21 are weekly bringing in new clothing. The impact that made on me was unbelievable. Basically, I didn't buy any new clothes for, like, 4 months. I was like, maybe 6 months. I was like, I don't even know what to do. It was kind of a crisis in a good way. I was like, okay, wow, I just have all of this information, and I can no longer live my life the way I had been living it before, because now I have this new information. What is the new way I'm going to live my life? So then I started finding, like, brands that are super ethical. And I found, like, this really cool one called Frank and Oak that's Canadian. And so I was like, even better, because they don't have to ship that far. And so I started only buying clothes from Frank and Oak for, like, a year. And then I was like, wait a minute, this is really expensive. So then I started thrifting. And, like, I actually today wore this sweater, which is one of my best thrift finds ever. Look at the embroidery
so
detail.
Good.
Thank you. So that documentary made such a giant impact on me, and I think I've been searching for a book on climate change that does that for me ever since. I didn't mean to go on such a rant about that, but
no, but I know it's that thing that is, like, something will click for you and you don't know what it is, but something and it's different for everybody. And I think, again, with fast fashion, it's actually kind of helpful to see all of that visually. But then with the climate crisis, the problem for me is that it's impossible to represent visually. And if we try with a polar bear, it's kind of irrelevant. And we're all already numb to those kind of images. And also just stuff like, what's the fact that I wrote down that was like, if human history is a day, we only started eating meat at 10 to midnight. Like,
amazing.
Do you know what I mean? But if you were trying to visualize the whole of human history in a documentary, I would either involve a lot of, like, embarrassing stock footage or, like, a bad cartoon of, like, a man walking upright, or do you know what I mean? But just a sentence that's like, here's the clock, this is human history, at 10 to midnight we started eating meat, And that's how long we've been eating meat, not that freaking long.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, so I think it depends. Now you're speaking about it, it makes me think, like, I think it depends on the topic and the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like, you had asked me to prepare.
Yes.
Some quotes, images, or facts that really stood out to me. And there were a couple that I'm still absolutely thinking about. So let us flip to page 114.
In your hymn books, please.
A quick line here, but it says, many have attributed the rise of the environmental movement to those first photographs of Earth. Some credit the planet's apparent fragility in the images, alone, unsupported, and suspended in black, for inspiring a collective desire to protect it. So this whole kind of section was just something I never thought about. I'd never thought about how, of course, for most underlined, most of human history, we didn't actually know what Earth looked like.
Yeah.
Because we have my whole life, right? My whole life we've had photos of the Earth and of the moon and et cetera, et cetera. So it hasn't in my own life made that big of an impact. But reading this kind of pulled me out of my own life a little bit. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, in the grand scheme of things, we didn't even know we were this little planet. We didn't even know what we looked like. We didn't even know that we were blue and green. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It's such a beautiful, powerful image, and it really did make me pause to think. I think it is in this book, unless I'm thinking about a different book, but I really think it was in this book that he talks about how incredibly bad we are at passing information down for generations. So it's sort of like our grandparents were like dealing with some issue, and then their kids might have dealt with the impacts of that a little bit. But then they're not going to pass it down to us.
Yeah.
And so we have this small memory. It's like this really small memory of human existence. And so we keep repeating mistakes. We're not learning from the past. And this was one of those moments where I was like, oh, that really pulled me into the past in a cool way.
Yeah. And it also made me think about, like, because at the same time when they talk about the Earth, like the first images of the Earth, he also talks about the first mirrors. Like, it didn't occur to me that people didn't have mirrors until like the 1400s. So people didn't know what they looked like. So people had no sense of self-reflection or like this kind of like being able to step out of yourself and look at and conceptualize, like, what? I actually made me feel like human history is quite new, and you know, if it all goes tits up, it's been a great ride. So it's dark, but like, do you know what I mean? It's that thing of like, sometimes we talk about saving the planet when actually we're just talking about saving a very small section of the Earth's history, which is our history and our like our opportunity to live on it, which is kind of like both sad and quite relaxing for me in a weird way, like to think like this is all quite new. We're all, and I think also that like there's parts of it that helped me to think about like human evil, because you were talking about how it's like things don't get passed down. Like, humans are quite shoddy. Like, I don't think that most humans are inherently evil. They're just like chaotic, and the fact that you don't pass on like generational wisdom a lot of the time, or there's repeating patterns in history that rhyme, and like also he had this idea about like how we all get out of the way for an ambulance and we don't really think about it, but if you hear an ambulance coming, everybody turns off the road, and that's not because like we're inherently making a moral decision in the moment, or that like we're like amazing or good. It's just that like that's what you do. And I think we're so like we're kind of these innocent but also horrific like little animals that wander around like repeating patterns and eating, and do you know what I mean?
No, 100%. One thing we haven't kind of talked about is the structure of the book. So the first, let's call it quarters, but that's not even accurate at all. The first quarter of the book is a little bit memoir-y, and he's talking a little bit about his past book, and he's talking about his own relationship to food and how his grandmother is passing away, and like all of these interesting things that relate to his experience of climate change right now. Then the second quarter of the book, it's not even a quarter, but this is so inaccurate. The second section of the book is facts.
Yes.
Like, they're literally just bullet point facts. That was probably my favorite section of the book.
That's so interesting, because I think that's my least favorite section of the book.
I loved it. I was like, give me the cold hard facts. And there's some fascinating facts here. Like, so I love this one. In America, 1 out of every 5 meals is eaten in a car.
Fucking hell.
But that is useful.
Yeah.
That's useful because I'm thinking about that and I'm like, yeah, I definitely, and obviously this is pre-pandemic, right? So before we weren't really going out as much, but I'm thinking about like, okay, well, it's true. If this is a thing, we need better vegetarian options at drive-thrus.
Yeah.
Like we need them because that is where people are eating, right?
Whether we like it or not. Like that's where
people are eating. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. It just matters that it's happening. And so we adapt to that change. And like, I almost exclusively eat at A&W if I'm going to a fast food place because they're the only ones in Canada that offer a vegetarian burger. Like it's a Beyond Meat patty or whatever. So I was like, yeah. And so they've bought my business. Yeah. I'm like, you know, that whole concept of like supporting with your dollars. On the next page, I love this other fact too. 9 out of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred since the first YouTube video in 2005. I've forgotten that one. Since the one about the zoo, ironically. Yeah. Also, it was about animals. Me at the zoo. That was the name of the video. I loved this section because I found it, I don't know, I guess I found it separate from his life. And so for me, I was able to link it to my life a little bit more. Oh, you kind of asked about this, but like, I think maybe we'll get into it. But basically, he does have a very different life than us. Yes. Right? Yeah, I think I pointed out. You should ask me. Yeah, let's go into that. It's okay. But you know, he's the problem with once people are successful, they still recording their life, which they should do. But it becomes like, you know, somebody who's a world-renowned best-selling author and is traveling around the world all the time. Yeah, it's not us. And also, you know, he's very much rooting in his own experience, which is really useful. He's like Jewish American, and he talks about his grandma escaping the Nazis and like her journey doing that, and this idea of like trying to save yourself and not being able to compute what is coming, but acting anyway. And then also like I was just like, he's a dude. He probably, I'm only guessing, probably doesn't have all of the like sexist things to do with food choices and like inherent trauma collectively around being told that like you shouldn't eat this and you should eat that, and like, do you know what I mean? Like he wasn't. You know what I think about a lot? Yeah. Men never order salads. I know. That's very confusing. It's fragile masculinity. But like, well, yes, exactly. And so what you're saying is actually really relevant to this specific conversation. Like, if we need to eat more plant-based meals, a very easy plant-based meal is a salad. Salads don't have to suck. Salads are great, right? But like, if you're a man and you feel like eating a salad is like a feminine meal, you're not going to eat them. And so it makes it that much more difficult for you to avoid meat. Yeah. So like you're saying, like, that is interesting. There's a really interesting podcast that I'm going to link below about masculinity and meat, and all about how it feels emasculating to not eat meat because it's this illusion that you've killed it, and like it's part of your like hunting process. Like it's crazy, and there's also this numbing around like, oh, I can hurt other things because that's what makes me a man. So I think like there's really interesting stuff around like that, and I think also just he's from the USA. And neither of us are. And a lot of the facts that he quotes are USA based, and some of them I want to believe aren't true in the UK, but could totally be true. Like 1 in 5 people eat in their cars. I can't really say either way. Maybe in the UK, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody told me that was true or if it was false. I don't know. But yeah, I think culturally our relationship with food is probably different. I think it's a really interesting point. Now, I was glad that you kind of wanted to just discuss that a little bit, because there were a couple of things in here that I was like, yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that's cool, but it doesn't really reflect or map onto my existence very well. A big part of this is something interesting that I'm struggling with, Leena. Everyone keeps screaming at me to not drive a car. Yeah. I get that. But they all live in New York or London. And I'm like, I'd love to take the train, but I live in the countryside, right? Like that piece of advice or that piece of actionable item is completely useless to this massive population of people who live rurally. Yeah. And like, genuinely, I can walk to a grocery store. It's about like probably a 35-minute walk just to get to the grocery store. And then I'd have to carry all my groceries back on that walk. So like I could figure that out. Maybe I could do like a bike thing. Not in the winter. Like I live in Canada, rurally in the winter. It's like a miracle when the snowplow comes by, right? Yeah. Like you're like, oh, thank God they plowed the streets this time. But like, I think that there's a lot of stuff in here that is very New York based. And I'm like, oh man, I don't know how to get rid of my car.
Again, like not to be like, in defense of Jonathan.
No,
but
you
like,
should be.
What was interesting, he was like, here are the 4 things that will probably help the planet. But I really like the reason I've picked the animal thing is because loads of people can't choose whether they drive or not. Most people aren't in the middle of deciding whether to have a kid or not, because that's kind of like a once in a lifetime decision. And I can't remember what the other one was, but like people choose to eat meat 3 times a day. So like it's what's the most regularly occurring decision that most people can
and so
change.
I agree. And I think that's important because that is his main point. His main point is just don't eat meat. And that is so actionable. And I also really like that he kind of went there a little bit. I was like, oh, he went there. When he was like, a lot of people talk about becoming vegetarian as elitist. And he's like, this is why I don't believe that it is elitist. Yeah. And like a lot of people say, I can't become a vegetarian because it's like exorbitantly expensive. It's more expensive. And he's like, this is why, based on these statistics, it isn't actually more expensive to eat healthy, like a healthy diet. But he also isn't like, this is going to work for everyone. He acknowledges food deserts, and he acknowledges that there are low-income areas where this isn't possible. And like there are, areas where your only options are fast food. Yeah. Right? Like he's not kind of trying to throw everyone under the bus and be like, you should all 100% be vegans. But he is kind of acknowledging a lot of people use these as excuses. Yeah. They're like, oh, no, it's like really privileged of you to say that. He's like, no, it's not. Most people can do this. And oh, it's really expensive. He's like, no, it's not actually as expensive as you're saying it is. Like, don't use that as an excuse to prohibit you from taking this important change. He talks about
how there's a meshing of 2 different statistics. So one statistic is it is more expensive for you to eat a healthy diet than it is for you to eat an unhealthy diet. Like, it's cheaper to eat an unhealthy diet, but if you're just comparing at any income level, vegetarian and non-vegetarian, then the vegetarian option is always cheaper. And they're it's how we're taught to read stats. And they're like 2 different tables, basically. Right. It's really just to catch people up. And I think you're right. I think there's a frustrating, we won't get into this too much because it's a whole other podcast, a frustrating impulse online to read a statistic and think, oh, this proves that it's not accessible for everybody. Therefore I don't have to
do it at all. Yeah.
And it's that thing of like, no, the whole point of privilege is you have it, so use it. Point out that other people don't, but it's just because something isn't universally applicable doesn't mean it's not, the majority can't action it,
Yeah. And like also it takes away this really important idea that is going to be and has been key to fighting climate change, which is early adopters. So a perfect example of this is solar panels. Yeah. Especially like 30 years ago, it was very difficult to afford solar panels because they are extremely expensive. Not very many people are trained on how to install them. So it's very expensive to hire those people. Like the entire process is very expensive. It is not very expensive anymore. It is probably expensive, and it's probably like, I haven't looked into it for my specific area yet. But like it is so much cheaper than it was. And that is because there were enough early adopters who were like, I'm willing to put up the cost because I believe in this technology, because I know that it's important. And so the idea of being like, oh, I'm not going to become a vegetarian because, not everyone can be a vegetarian. So it's like, that's a very privileged position. It's like, well, if most of us become vegetarian, the people that can afford it right now, then those, like, all the restaurants around us will notice. They will start offering cheaper vegetarian options, which make it cheaper for everyone so that more people can become it, right? Yeah. Like, sometimes you can't just, sometimes you have to be one of the first people to do it.
I think a big cultural moment for me in the UK was Greg's making a vegan sausage roll, because the sausage roll is a delicacy of the British public. It's sacred, and it's incredibly cheap. So the idea that Greg's was like, we're just going all in on this vegan sausage roll and we're going to promote it and it's going to be like a staple, it's a silly and insignificant and completely ridiculous but like significant moment to me. And again, it's like everybody's moments of significance and like, oh, things could change are different, but apparently vegan Greg sausage roll was my cultural touch point that gave me hope again.
There was one other really big moment that kind of made an impact for me. And I think actually this is the one that maybe has made the biggest impact because it's the one I keep mentioning to people. So it's on page 42 for anyone reading along at home. 96% of American families gather for a Thanksgiving meal. I love this fact. Yeah. Partly because it's beautiful to me that like an entire nation is doing a thing, and it doesn't talk about like if they're celebrating Thanksgiving. It's just that they're gathering, and I'm like, okay, that's really, really interesting. And 96%, like even if that statistic is a little inflated for some reason,
I mean, if it was 80, that would still be
be shocking to me.
Interesting.
So I was like, okay, wow, that's really fascinating. And then there's a second quote a page later on page 45 that is almost even more important, but it says, while it is probably the case that if the celebration of Thanksgiving were legally enforced, fewer people would celebrate it, it is certainly the case that if the celebration of Thanksgiving were not facilitated by being a national holiday, fewer people would celebrate it. The collective action occurs because the structure encourages it. Our amorphous, unurgent emotions about Thanksgiving need a scaffolding. Yeah. That for me is probably the most important line in the book. And I wished throughout that he had kind of gone back to talking a bit more about that, because I thought it was so interesting that it is so important that we have individual action, especially when it comes to our diet, because it isn't something that the government can like force you to do. Like they can't with like, they can ban cars. They can ban like, petrol cars. I said that for the British people out there. Petrol. Who do I think I am? But they can like, or encourage you to buy electric cars with grants or whatever. But they can't literally pick the food you eat, right? However,
yet
it does need, like he said, a scaffolding. And I thought that was a really great use of that word. Like we need both. We need the individual action, but we also need the governmental action. And actually, I wish he talked about that a bit more.
That kind of makes me feel like that's almost like a relaxing fact. Maybe not relaxing is a strong word.
I find it relaxing.
I find that one of the things that stops me talking about everything is because I'm like, we have to convince every single person. Every person has to be an activist. We have to convert everybody. When actually, you're right, we need to focus on the scaffolding. And this idea, again, he talks about this idea of like a crowd wave, where you're like in a crowd and somebody starts that wave and you just kind of join in. There's not a point where you make a decision. You don't really need to feel an emotion about it, but it'd be weird if you didn't do it. So let's go.
So you do it.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. And like, he also talks about how, oh gosh, I forget. It's in and around there, but he's talking about, it's voting. He's like, people in America don't vote as much as other countries. And again, this is a very American specific thing, and neither of us are Americans, so we can't exactly talk about it. But he talks about how maybe if it were a day off work, people would vote, or if they could vote online and it was like very quick and easy for them to do in the morning before they went to work or whatever, they would vote. Like, you have to make it as easy for people as possible, especially in a situation like this where I don't think he talks about like the American military, for example, which it has a giant impact on the environment and is completely out of our control, right? You and me are not American, so we can't even vote on legislation that would impact that. But even Americans can't really change like the budgeting for the military. So there's like all of these really big things that are not in our control. And I will say this, I have read other books about the environment that don't have the impact of meat as high as he does. And he even talks about in the end, he's like, some places quoted at like 14%, some places quoted at 50%. I think that it's 50 because of these reasons, but it could be lower. But even if it's 14%, like, it's still a really big piece of the pie.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, but it's not the majority of the pie. So like there's all of these other big issues that are governmental and above us, and like that. Basically, everyone watching this video, if you're still in school, switch your major, become a lawyer, change the system within the inside.
I think we really, in the future, we are going to need lawyers and psychiatrists and people who make people laugh, because God damn it, we're going to need a lot of that shit. But yeah, I think you're right, and I think he has this point in the book about how it's like this percentage of like, oh, but we don't cause climate change. 71% of the climate change is made by 100 companies. But he's like, but those 100 companies are providing products for you. So you are, do you know what I mean? Like, it's not.
That's a good fact.
There's so many like false equivalents there that are like, but then it's hard because you're right, because if a okay, here's what I'm thinking in my head.
Yes.
Maybe I'm an optimist. That's the issue here. If a government is in power and they see that 90% of the population switch to a vegetarian diet within a 5-year period, an unprecedented switch, what the hell? They're going to change what their policies are and what what their focus is, because, and it might be to do with the military, or it might be to do with like concrete or whatever, because that sends a sign that these people are pissed at what is going on. And do you know what I mean? Like, there is a symbolic impact that we can't really measure. If people change their diets, there are other implications of how 100%. Governments can act, because they're constantly gathering data on what we're doing all of the time. And don't we know it? Can you hear me, Apple? Bob from the CSI. CSI? CIA. I don't know who your police are, but...
one thing, like, I watched this video a while ago about Big Milk.
And that just sounds like a porn name. Please never say those two words together to me again.
It was a big conversation about the milk industry in America.
Yeah.
And in other ways, the rest of like the West. It was so fascinating how, and it's a perfect emblematic like situation for something that happens over and over and over again. But basically a long time ago, there were all these milk farmers and like they were doing great. And so the government was like, yeah, milk is pretty healthy. Let's tell the American public that they need a glass of milk a day.
Yeah,
let's tell them we actually need 2 glasses of milk a day because we have so much milk we need to sell. And then, they went to the war and they came back, and it was a great job for people to do. So they're like, let's subsidize this. Like, let's help the milk farmers out. But people don't care about milk anymore. And so all of this money goes into, like, the whole Got Milk campaign?
Yeah.
What is that? Like, when you think about it,
I know.
What is that? Like, I remember on the back of a kid's magazine when I was a kid, Spider-Man had the milk mustache. And now I'm thinking about this as a 27-year-old, and I'm like, what was that? Like, why is Spider-Man telling me to drink milk when actually the majority of humans are allergic to milk? Like, we all have a lactose intolerance. I'm like, what's happening right now? And I'm like, oh, it's the government dictating people's diets. Because they can, and they will, dependent on what is popular at the time, what is profitable to them, what people are lobbying for, what is the court of public opinion. And so, like you're saying, if enough people become vegetarian, become vegan, or at least start emphasizing it for more of their meals, it will absolutely make an impact that goes up the chain, like you're saying, we do vote with our dollars.
It's just so interconnected, isn't it, as well? Because advertising is a motive. Like, advertising isn't based on facts. They didn't put facts in the adverts. They put Spider-Man. Everybody fucking loves Spider-Man. Do you know what I mean? And it's the act of eating is inherently a motive. It's not like a logical one.
Yeah.
And it's the same way, I guess, with those family meals that we talk about and that kind of cultural difference and stuff. Because I think one of the things that I find hardest about being vegetarian is turning down food from people that I love, because do you know what I mean? The idea of being like, oh, sorry, Mum, I can't have this thing that you've created for me, and that symbolizes nourishment and acceptance and giving, and this stuff that, well, actually my mum is quite good about cooking vegetarian stuff now, but the idea of going into a family situation and rejecting something warm that somebody has made
Yes.
you, that symbolizes belonging. And like, you know, there's so much stuff around boundaries and like, there's just so much to unpack there. And I think like you just can't talk about food in isolation. Like it has to be linked to everything else.
You're totally right. And I find it like when I was first going vegetarian, my rule was I am only going to buy vegetarian food for myself, and I'm only going to buy vegetarian food at restaurants.
Yeah.
So like those were 2 rules that were actually such an easy transition.
Yeah.
Because exactly like you're saying, it was very devoid of all of that like family tradition and family relationships. Like it was just like, I'm at the grocery store, I'm just going to buy myself not cheese or whatever. Like I'm at a restaurant eating with my friends. They don't care if I eat meat, right? Like they don't care what I'm gonna.
Yeah.
No, it's not their plate. They don't care what I'm paying for at this decision. So that was a really easy way to transition into it. Top tip.
It's like you could call it like being a wallet vegan or something. Like,
oh yeah,
my money doesn't go towards it. Like
yes,
there's got to be like loads of different categories.
That's a really interesting. Is that a thing, or did you just make that up?
I just made it up. It's probably a thing. Nothing's original in this world. But there's so like wallet vegan. There's the like breakfast and lunch vegan, brunch vegan, brunch vegans. There's people who, so something I talked about in another video, and then some people in the Gumption Club are actually talking about doing it, is like sharing being vegan with somebody. So shift vegans. So like, I'll be a vegan on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You can be a vegan on Thursday. And between us, we'll be a vegan.
Yeah.
And like,
I love that.
We need to have a little like pie chart or like some kind of pick your vegan style.
That made me think about another, it wasn't my favorite book, but I did enjoy the book. Like, I did take a lot out of it. I hope that that's coming out in the video.
My ego isn't hurt at all.
But, like, one thing I did write down was, like, I sort of wish this had been a cookbook. I don't know if that's a really weird thing to say. But, you know, like, it's like there's a lot of different cookbooks out there. There are literal just like every page is a recipe books. But then there's also more like memoir cookbooks where it's like my relationship with food and how I learned this recipe and now here it is how you cook it, right? I was like, maybe it was too ambitious of a crossover, but if Jonathan Safran Foer had been able to make like a literary fiction memoir cookbook, I think I would have actually liked that more, because obviously his main point is just eat vegetables. Just eat vegetables, plant-based.
Yeah.
Go plant-based. And I'm like, what are you eating? Like, I was really curious. I was really curious. Like, I bet you've got some really cool recipes. And, like, have you been able to adapt any of your grandmother's Jewish recipes into vegetarian recipes? And, like, I was, like, getting hungry, but not knowing what to cook. Yeah. A classic conundrum for people who are becoming vegetarians or vegans. I'm like, help them out. Tell them some recipes. I thought that would have been cool. I don't know if that's weird.
We can definitely pitch it to him. I'll talk to his people.
Send him a little email.
I'll be like, can somebody get me Jonathan on the phone? We've got an amazing idea.
And okay, also eating animals is a documentary, right?
Yeah, which again I haven't watched.
I haven't seen that either, so that might be, if people are scared to read the book, just watch the 2-hour documentary and it's done and over with.
I'm quickly realizing that I am doing the thing where you create a medicine that you in fact need yourself, because this is what this series is. It's like, I'm making this because I need it. But the same with like the film Don't Look Up.
Yes. I love that movie.
I haven't watched it because of that. And everyone's like, Leena, you talk about climate change on the internet. This is you love all the actors in this. Look, everybody's in it. Meryl Streep's in it, isn't she?
Yeah, she sucks. No, like she's well acted. Just the character sucks.
But the recipe means that I should love this, and I still haven't even reactivated my Netflix account to watch it because I'm like, I don't want to. Not today.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because it came out on the 24th. I watched it on the 25th, on Christmas. They should not have released that movie as a kind of a Christmas film, because it was so stressful.
Yeah.
And it's largely, like, obviously it is a big metaphor for climate change. And it's like, you idiots, like humans, we eat too much, we buy too much, and you're like on Christmas, the kind of the one day of the year where you definitely do eat too much and you do buy too much, and you're like, could you have given this to me like in January?
Yeah, you have to think about the human psychology of when people are most receptive to receive an idea, because I feel like Christmas
it was not the most receptive, and like so many of the reviews are extremely negative, and like people hating on this film, and they're like, why are you guilting us? Yeah. And I was like, no one mentions Christmas, but I'm like, I think it's because it came out the week of Christmas.
People but it also doesn't mention climate change, right? It's just about a meteor.
It's about a meteor, but it doesn't specifically mention, but it's like, it's so obvious.
Yeah, I can imagine. As you might be able to tell, when me and Ariel usually have conversations, they last, and this is not a metaphor, 4 hours.
4 hours.
So
I don't think we've ever had a 3-hour conversation.
Never happened. So I am with a heavy heart going to have to wrap this up a little bit. But I think when I was like pulling out quotes and stuff that he talks about how the problem with climate change is that it's a sticky subject, as in like it's awkward, but it's not it doesn't stick with people. It's not a sticky subject in that things don't stay with it. But one thing I think, like when I was reflecting on this and rereading it, something that I think has stayed with me that isn't in the book but it's just a slogan in my head is like, you don't have to wait for it to click. Like I feel like this book did help things click for me, but also one of the messages is like, you don't have to wait to feel anything to do something, and you may never feel anything. And there's two quotes that I wanted to pull out. One was like a bit more, this is the school teacher side of it, but I needed to hear it, Jonathan, but it might, if it hurts. You are entirely capable of doing things you aren't moved to do and refraining from things that you want to do. That doesn't make you Gandhi, it just makes you an adult. Which I was like, oh God. But it's true, there's loads of stuff I refrain from doing every day, like, I don't know, punching strangers in supermarkets who are rude to me. Like, I know that's not acceptable and I don't believe in it, so I'm not going to do it, but the urge is still there. And then also this other quote was that saving ourselves will require collective action, and acting collectively will change us. Especially if we change not because we are inspired to, not because we see the light, but rather because, sensing an approaching dark, we come ourselves to act on knowledge that we cannot believe. So this idea of like waiting to see the light, or waiting to feel like it's time for us to become vegan, or like it's time for us to like do something, is never going to happen. And I think maybe those like don't look up and stuff is chasing that feeling for people and being like, I want them to feel this. And sometimes you just got to take yourself by the reins and be like, Leena, put it down. you know what I mean? Like so many like kind of like behaviors that I think we've grown up with that are like kind of like self-destructive. I just have to be like, no, Leena, like you can't do that anymore. It's not good. We're 30 now. And I think I had that conversation with myself about meat, where I was like, it doesn't matter what you feel. The adult part of your brain is making a decision for the child part of your brain, and like parenting yourself and being like, but I think also the idea of like, I feel like most humans, some days it feels like most humans are so incapable of collective action, me included. So this idea that it's like, let's go rally together and we're going to be activists, it's going to be amazing, like it feels so inescapably silly when I look at most people. Me included.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when I first bought this book 5 years ago or whatever, 3 years ago, when I started reading it, and I was loving, like the first chapter is, for me, my favorite section of the book. Like he talks about, and it's a classic metaphor and people make it for the pandemic as well, but like looking at collective action during World War II and the amount of sacrifice that people had to make in order to, at like the last hope, very, very hopeful, help their soldiers that had gone abroad, right?
Yeah.
And he's talking from the American perspective. Okay, so when I first read that 4 years ago, I was like so inspired, and I was like, wow, I can't wait to read this book. And partly that's probably why I didn't read it. I was like, it's so good. I have to read it at the perfect moment, which is a curse. But when I read it this time, I also really loved that chapter and I found it really interesting. But it's all been tainted by COVID for me. And I'm like, are we capable of collective action? I'm not too sure, because like people won't wear the masks and people won't get vaccinated, but that's like really doomsday thinking, because in fact, I mean, I'll just speak about in Canada, over 90% of people are vaccinated, right? like the vast majority of people do wear their masks. I have never been in a shop in Canada. I've never been in a shop where somebody had to ask somebody to put their mask on. Like, people do it. They put their masks on. It's different in the UK, but they put their masks on here. So I'm like, maybe I shouldn't be that worried about it. I don't know. Like, I'm glad you brought it up because it is difficult to like feel like and exactly like you're saying. So therefore, because it is difficult to always embrace collective change and feel that hopeful, we can't just wait for the hope to hit. This is also like a piece of advice I've heard for artists. It's like, you can't only create on the days when you feel inspired, because those days are so rare and oftentimes aren't even as productive as you would hope they would be. So you've got to just show up every day anyways.
Yeah, so I think you're right. And I think this line in it that says, acting collectively will change us. It's that thing of like, once you actually start acting on it, maybe we will start feeling like we're more together. And with the coronavirus stuff and versus the war thing, what was really interesting, I was learning that there like were Nazi deniers. Like, there were people who were like, I'm not going to participate in the blackout. Like, I'm going to, you know, I'm going to refuse to participate in collective saving ourselves. So I think we romanticize that a bit.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think it's pretty easy to romanticize the past and be like, oh, God, in the past we were heroes and everyone worked together. And I'm like, no, that's literally impossible. There was never a time when we all agreed on something.
Yeah. Oh, God. And I think it's that thing of like, sometimes you just got to save the people that don't want to be saved. And sometimes you've still got to like hope that the percentage is high enough that it will work. But I don't think the existence of those people should negate like our own conduct. Now I'm sounding like a headmistress. Yeah. But like, you know, like, I think just because other people aren't wearing a mask doesn't mean that I'm not going to, because I recognize that. Yeah, it's all. Anyway,
I think one thing I will say that gives me hope is that I am proud of some of the changes I've made in my life, right? And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, I've figured it out. No, there's loads of things I haven't figured out yet. But I am proud of the progress I've made in my personal life. And the thing that does give me hope about that is, and that I want to relate to everyone watching, is that most of them were one-time decisions. So like, me deciding not to buy clothing that is fast fashion, and so I haven't in 5 or 6 years, it was just, I just made the decision. I was like, okay, I don't do that anymore. And I was like, I don't have to think about that. It was a decision. Yeah. Right? And like, becoming a vegetarian was just a decision. And I was like, okay, cool. And like, there are exceptions, and especially like I just mentioned, during the pandemic, it got a lot messier. And I'm like I'm constantly trying to get back on the train. But like, okay, here's a perfect example. Milk. Apparently I'm anti-milk. I don't drink milk. I only drink oat milk.
Same.
Easy decision I made. And it completely cut out that one area of dairy, right? I was like, no, I don't think about milk anymore. That is a decision I've solved.
I've broken up with it. I've deleted his name from my phone.
It's done.
I blocked him.
When I bought this house a year ago, I moved into it knowing that there were certain renovations that were going to have to be made, and that they were going to take a certain amount of time because of the cost. One of the problems with this house is that it runs on oil heat. So my heating is oil-based. Literally, perhaps the worst way that I could heat a house, like environmental lens-wise, right? I'm not feeling guilt about it because I know I'm going to change it in the next 1 to 2 years, and I'm going to upgrade to a heat pump, which is what we all should do. Invest in a heat pump. They're expensive, but it's good. But my point is that like, it's a decision, right? It's like a one-time decision. You put up the cost, and I'm not saying that you can just do it, so easily, just save up for a year. No, like, maybe you'll have to save up for longer, but like, once you've made the decision, you just do it, and then you don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, there are elements of it.
A real tension between people who feel like the identity of it and like the strict rules is what's stopping them. But then for other people, I think that's what frees them. And like you're saying, like, I think I cut down meat a lot, but I got decision fatigue. I was like, how many times have I eaten meat this week? I can't count. I'm trying to count down. Like, what is this meal gonna be worth it for me? Like, and just the decision fatigue actually made it easier for me to just be like, not eating meat ever again. Like, but I think it's like always personal. Like it depends on who you are and how your brain works and what point you're at. But I think you're right. It's like once, instead of it becoming an identity, it's just like a permanent choice that you're like, this is just, this is the ruling. This is the pattern my life's going to take. And it doesn't need to be.
It's sort of like, it's like setting up defaults.
Yeah.
On your computer or whatever, you're like, yeah, default, when I turn this on, open Spotify. Okay? Yeah, we're going to want that. I'll run it. But like, there's certain defaults, like, and a lot of them aren't like decisions I made, but for example, I've noticed a trend that like, if I don't know what color to buy of an item, I buy it in pink and everything works out. I'm like, great. That's like kind of a default I've set up. Well, default is I do oat milk. And if you don't have oat, I'll do almond. And if you don't have almond, I don't need milk. Thank you. That's fine.
You got a little flow chart for your life going on
without the situation. So setting up those defaults though, I think also what you've mentioned about identity is really important. I don't, this is probably going to get me in trouble, but I don't put like climate change activist in my bio or like I don't label myself as a vegetarian because it's too much pressure.
Yeah.
It's just too much. You don't need to give yourself that much pressure. You're allowed to like be a vegetarian some of the time and also not some of the time and do these things sometimes and not sometimes. And so I think you're right. Like by trying to put a whole identity on it, it does create so much pressure because then if you mess up just once, you've messed up the whole identity.
Yeah.
So
and then who are you without it? And like, yeah, you're right.
I identify as trying my best.
And you're pulling it off so well. On that note,
you have to end it.
On that note, I think that's a nice way to just end it. Take its head off. Thank you so much for chatting to me about this. And I think that's what's cool. Even when you read a book together and you feel differently about it, you end up having really interesting conversations that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And because humans are so bumbling and ridiculous and chaotic, sometimes we need to like have a prompt to be like, I want to talk to you about this thing, but I don't know how. Like, let's get into it through a book. So thank you so much for doing that with me today.
Thank you for having me, Leena. I'm always so grateful to be on your channel. I love your videos. I love this series. Everyone subscribe.
And you should also subscribe to Ariel because I want to see that pump when it comes in. I want to see it. That's what I'm subscribed for. I'm just waiting for the pump video. Yeah. So thank you so much. Next month we are going to be reading Consumed by Aja Barber, and the guest is going to be Ash Tanya, who I love, and I've already like ranted about on this channel and been like, her channel's amazing. So Ash Tanya is going to be with us next month. So if you do want to read with us, you can, but this is not a reading club and you can just join in without having read it. That's totally fine. I don't have anything else to say, but that's probably for the best, isn't it?
Yeah, we nailed it. We finally ran out of things to say. Rare.
I mean, I haven't, but I have to. To be clear, there's more in the tank.
We have had to reset our memory cards like 4 times because we keep having more things to say.
Thank you so much for watching. There are more videos about the climate here if you fancy watching that. But if you don't, here are some videos about something completely different. Frogs log out.